The hydroponics bay hummed with artificial life, but Kale Torn could only see death. 6 months had passed since the Zephyrian Empire reduced Verdania to ash and molten rock. Yet every green leaf in this underground refuge reminded him of what he'd lost. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He who had once coaxed life from barren soil now tended gardens in the belly of a dead asteroid, keeping alive the last remnants of his people. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," said Mira Castwell, one of the few other Verdanian survivors. She moved carefully between the growing beds, her weathered hands gentle on the young plants. At 67, she was old enough to remember when their homeworld had been green from pole to pole. Before the war, before the Empire decided that Verdania's strategic location was worth more than its 3 billion inhabitants, Kale nodded absently, his attention focused on the data pad in his hands. The readings looked normal: temperature, humidity, nutrient levels all within acceptable parameters. But normal was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Helix Station, their current sanctuary, housed barely 12,000 refugees scattered across a dozen asteroid colonies. They were a dying race, and Kale felt the weight of that extinction pressing down on him like the vacuum of space itself. "You're thinking about her again," Mira observed, settling onto a bench beside the cucumber trellises. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied his face with maternal concern. "Anya wouldn't want you to torture yourself like this." "Anya is dead," Kale replied flatly, not looking up from his readings. "They're all dead. My parents, my sister, my fiancé, everyone I ever loved turned to vapor in 30 seconds of orbital bombardment." His voice remained steady, emotionless. 6 months of grief had burned away his capacity for tears. Mira was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "The council wants to see you. Something about your research proposal." Kel's head snapped up. For 3 months, he'd been submitting requests to access the deep archives, specifically the classified terraforming projects that Verdania had abandoned decades ago, when they'd chosen peaceful agriculture over military applications. The council had rejected every request, citing security concerns and the need to focus on immediate survival, rather than theoretical research. "When?" he asked. "Now, if you can spare the time from brooding," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The walk through Helix Station's corridors always depressed Kale. What had once been designed as a mining operation now served as a makeshift city, its cramped passages filled with the hollow-eyed faces of the displaced. Children who should have been playing in sunlit fields instead attended classes in repurposed storage bays. Conference Room 7 was barely large enough for the 5 members of the Refugee Council. Tomas Varden, a former agricultural minister, sat at the head of the table. His once impressive frame had grown gaunt in the months since the evacuation, and his hair had gone completely gray. "Kale," Tomas began without preamble, "we've reviewed your latest request regarding the Genesis archives, and—" Kale kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "And we're going to grant it," Elena Bright said, sliding a data chip across the table. "Limited access, mind you. Level 3 clearance only." Kale stared at the chip as if it might disappear. "May I ask what changed your minds?" Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his scholarly features creased with worry. "We've received intelligence through the refugee network. The Empire isn't content with having destroyed Verdania. They're systematically hunting down survivors across the galaxy. 3 more colonies have been found and eliminated in the past month. They want us extinct," Tomas added grimly, "completely extinct, which brings us to your research." Elena continued, "If the Empire is determined to finish what they started, then perhaps it's time we stop thinking defensively. Your background in adaptive botany and terraforming gives you a unique perspective. We need to know if there's anything in those archives that might help us survive or fight back." 2 hours later, alone in the quantum computing lab deep in the station's core, Kale inserted the data chip and began his descent into Verdania's buried secrets. The Genesis archives contained 40 years of classified research into what the public had been told were agricultural enhancement projects. The reality was far more complex. Project Lazarus had been Verdania's answer to the growing militarization of the galaxy, rather than build weapons of destruction. They had chosen to develop the ultimate tool of creation, self-replicating terraforming organisms capable of transforming dead worlds into garden paradises. Within decades rather than centuries, the project had been shelved when the Galactic Accords banned weaponized terraforming, deemed dangerous after several test worlds had been accidentally rendered uninhabitable by runaway biological processes. But as Cale dove deeper into the files, he began to see possibilities that the original researchers had missed. The same organisms that could spread life across a barren world could, with minor genetic modifications, spread something else entirely. The Zephyrian Empire controlled 17 worlds. Across four star systems, their homeworld, Zephyr Prime, was a testament to their industrial might. Vast cities of gleaming metal and synthetic materials rising from landscapes stripped of all natural vegetation. The Empire viewed nature as inefficient, chaotic, something to be dominated and reshaped according to their rigid aesthetic preferences, which made them perfect targets for what Cale was beginning to envision. Fascinating reading. Cale spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway of the lab. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to glow in the dim lighting. Her clothes marked her as another refugee, but there was something about her bearing that suggested she hadn't always been powerless. "I'm sorry, the lab is supposed to be secured," Cale said, reaching instinctively to close the files he'd been studying. "Relax," the woman said, stepping into the room. "I'm Nira Salas. I just arrived on the transport from Kepler Station." She produced an identification card that confirmed her refugee status. Former environmental engineer, Verdanian, Colonial Authority. "I heard through the station gossip that someone was finally getting access to the Genesis archives." As she moved closer to examine his workstation, Cale caught a subtle scent, something floral and complex, that reminded him painfully of Enya's favorite perfume. But there was something else about Nira Salas, something that didn't quite fit. And, in the darkness between stars, seeds of possibility began to take root. The observation deck of the Zephyrian Research Station Dominion's Edge offered a breathtaking view of the gas giant Tempest, its swirling storms painted in shades of amber and violet against the star-filled void. But Nira Salas found no beauty in the sight. Each time she gazed upon those alien skies, she was reminded of how far she was from the green fields of home, and how deep her deception had become. 3 weeks had passed since her encounter with Cale Torn on Helix Station, and the memory of his pain-filled eyes haunted her dreams. She had returned to her post as a deep-cover intelligence operative for the Zephyrian Military Command, but everything felt different now. The sterile corridors of the station, once a symbol of imperial efficiency, now seemed cold and lifeless compared to the desperate hope she'd witnessed in the refugee gardens. "Agent Salas, report to Briefing Room Alpha immediately." The mechanical voice echoed through her quarters, interrupting her brooding. She straightened her uniform, the crisp gray fabric, bearing the silver insignia of the engineering corps, and made her way through the station's pristine hallways. The briefing room contained a holographic display showing star charts of the Outer Ring territories. Standing before it was General Thane Chorus, a man whose scarred face told the story of a career built on violence. His cybernetic left eye whirred softly as it focused on her approach. "Agent Salas," he began without preamble, "your infiltration of the Verdanian refugees has yielded interesting intelligence. Tell me about this botanist Cale Torn." Nira kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. "A broken man, seeking revenge, sir. He's gained access to classified terraforming research and appears to be developing some form of biological weapon." "Excellent," Chorus smiled, the expression making his scarred features even more grotesque. "And his emotional state? Unstable, consumed by grief over his dead fiancé and family. He's isolated himself from the other refugees and works obsessively on his research." The words tasted like poison in her mouth, each one a betrayal of the gentle man she'd met in that laboratory. Perfect. A weapon driven by revenge is far more reliable than one motivated by ideology. Chorus manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on a cluster of asteroid colonies. "How close is he to completion?" "Unknown, sir. The Genesis archives are extensive, and I was only able to observe his work briefly before maintaining my cover required me to leave. Then it's time for you to return, Chorus decided. But this time, you won't be observing. You'll be assisting. Nira felt her blood turn to ice. Sir, we're going to help Mr. Torin complete his weapon, the general explained, his cybernetic eye gleaming. And then we're going to ensure it's deployed exactly where we want it. I don't understand. Why would we help him create something that could threaten the Empire? Chorus laughed, a sound like grinding metal, because, my dear agent, the Empire has enemies beyond the Verdanian refugees. The Altarian Federation has been growing bold lately, testing our borders, challenging our expansion. What better way to remind them of their place than to demonstrate what happens to those who oppose us? The horrifying scope of the plan began to dawn on Nira. You want to frame the Verdanians for an attack on Altarian worlds. Precisely. Torin's bioweapon gets deployed against Altarian colonies, devastating their infrastructure and killing millions. The Empire, of course, will be shocked and appalled by this act of terrorism. We'll have no choice but to hunt down and eliminate the remaining Verdanian refugees in retaliation. Meanwhile, the Altarians will be too weakened to pose any further threat to our expansion, and Torin will believe he's striking back at the Empire right up until the moment we put a bullet in his head, Chorus said casually. 2 problems solved with 1 solution. It's really quite elegant. Nira nodded, slowly, fighting to keep her horror from showing. When do I return to Helix Station? Tomorrow. And Agent? Chorus stepped closer, his scarred face inches from hers. Remember where your loyalties lie. The Empire has been generous to you, given you purpose after your homeworld chose to resist our incorporation. Don't make me regret that generosity alone. In her quarters hours later, Nira stared at her reflection in the polished metal wall. The woman looking back at her bore the face of Nira solace, but the soul behind those green eyes belonged to someone else entirely. Nira Valdris of New Altair, one of the few survivors of the Zephyrian pacification of her world 5 years ago. The irony was suffocating. She had infiltrated the Empire to gather intelligence for the Altarian resistance, only to discover that her own people were now targets of the very weapon she was meant to help create. Every choice before her led to betrayal of the Empire that had enslaved her, of the Altarians who trusted her, or of Kale whose pain she had come to understand all too well. She activated her encrypted communicator, sending a message to a relay station in neutral space. The text was brief and coded, but its meaning was clear. Project compromised. Empire planning false flag operation. Torin is unwitting pawn. Altarian colonies targeted. Advise. The response came within hours. Maintain cover. Protect asset. Delay completion if possible. Extraction not feasible. Nira laughed bitterly. Protect asset meaning Kale. The resistance wanted her to save the man whose weapon could destroy them, while the Empire wanted her to help him perfect it. And somewhere in the middle of this impossible situation was a broken botanist who had no idea he was being manipulated by forces far beyond his understanding. 3 days later, she stood once again in the gardens of Helix Station, watching Kale tend to his plants with the same gentle care she remembered. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe relief. You came back, he said simply. I said I would, she replied, though the words carried weight neither of them fully understood yet. I've been thinking about what you said, about finding peace. He set down his tools and turned to face her fully. I think I might need help. With the research, I mean, a different perspective. Nira felt her heart break a little more. I'd be honored to help. As they walked together toward the quantum lab, she wondered if there was any way to save them all, Kale from his revenge, her people from destruction, and herself from the lies that were slowly consuming her soul. The seeds of deception had been planted, but perhaps in the garden of an impossible love, something true might yet grow. The cargo hold of the smuggling vessel Wandering Star reeked of engine coolant and desperation. Jorik Voss crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, his weathered hands steady despite the pulse rifle trained on the customs inspector's head. At 42, the former Verdanian pilot had learned that survival in the galaxy's shadow economy required equal Parts charm and violence. Now, Inspector Valdez, Jorik said conversationally. I think we both know those manifest discrepancies. You mentioned are really just clerical errors, easily overlooked for the right consideration. The Terran inspector, a thin man with nervous eyes, nodded frantically. Of course, Captain Voss, my mistake entirely. Everything appears to be in order. Excellent. Jorik lowered his weapon, but kept it visible. And I trust this little misunderstanding won't appear in any official reports. What misunderstanding? Valdez replied, sweat beading on his forehead. 20 minutes later, Jorik watched the customs shuttle depart from his ship's bridge, its pilot no doubt eager to forget the entire encounter. The inspector's bribe money would buy silence for now, but Jorik knew his reputation in this sector was becoming problematic. Too many customs officials remembered his face. Too many port authorities flagged his ship's registry. Captain, his pilot Zara Chen called from the navigation station. We're receiving a coded transmission. Refugee frequency. Jorik frowned. He'd made it clear to every Verdanian survivor network that he was done with their cause. Fighting the Empire was a luxury for those who still believed in justice. Jorik believed only in staying alive and keeping his small crew fed. Put it through, he said reluctantly. The voice that emerged from the speakers was young, desperate, and achingly familiar. This is Thomas Varden of the Helix Station Refugee Council. We need to speak with Captain Voss regarding urgent assistance. The survival of our people may depend on it. Jorik closed his eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. Thomas had been his squadron leader during the last days of Verdania, when they'd thrown every available pilot against the Imperial fleet in a futile attempt to buy time. For the evacuation ships, together, they'd watched their homeworld burn. Sir? Zara prompted. Should I respond? Set course for the Helix station, Jorik said quietly, and prep the ship for a full supply run. Something tells me we're going to need everything we can carry. The journey to Helix station took 18 hours through hyperspace, giving Jorik plenty of time to regret his decision. The asteroid colony looked exactly as he remembered from his last visit. 6 months ago, a desperate attempt to create home from the bones of dead rock. But this time, something felt different. There was an energy in the communications traffic, a sense of purpose that had been absent during his previous visits. Thomas Varden met him at the docking bay, and Jorik was shocked by the change in his former commander. The man had always been lean, but now he looked gaunt, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. More telling were his eyes. They held a hardness that Jorik recognized, the look of someone who had made peace with terrible necessities. Jorik, Thomas said, clasping his hand firmly. Thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet. Jorik replied, I'm not sure what you think I can do that your own people can't. Walk with me. Thomas led him through the station's corridors, past the same hollow-eyed refugees Jorik remembered. But there was something else now. Clusters of people working with focused intensity. Techs and scientists huddled over equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a refugee colony. We have someone working on a solution to our Empire problem, Thomas explained quietly. A brilliant botanist named Kale Torin. But his research requires materials that aren't exactly available through normal channels. They stopped at an observation window overlooking one of the hydroponics bays. Below, Jorik could see a dark-haired man working alongside a striking woman with auburn hair. Even from a distance, the intensity of their collaboration was evident. Terraforming equipment. Jorik guessed, industrial-grade biological processors. The kind of gear that's heavily regulated and flagged by every security agency in the galaxy. Among other things, Thomas confirmed. The question is whether you're willing to help us acquire it. Jorik studied the pair below more carefully. There was something about the way they worked together as synchronization that spoke of more than professional partnership. And if I refuse, then we find another way. Thomas said simply, but it will take longer, and time is something we don't have much of. The Empire's hunt for survivors is accelerating. A chill ran down Jorik's spine. What exactly is Torin planning? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Something that will ensure the Empire never threatens another world the way they threatened ours. That evening, Jorik found himself in the station's small cantina, nursing a drink that tasted like recycled coolant while he watched the crowd. Most were refugees like him, people trying to forget horrors they'd witnessed. But scattered throughout were individuals who carried themselves differently: scientists, technicians, maybe even a few former military personnel. Your Jorok Voss. He turned to find the auburn-haired woman from the hydroponics bay standing beside his table. Up close, she was even more striking, with intelligent green eyes and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. "And you're the mysterious botanist's partner," he replied, gesturing to an empty chair. "Nira Salas," she said, settling across from him. "Environmental engineer, and you're considering whether to help us or turn around and fly away." Smart woman. Jorok studied her face, noting the slight tension around her eyes. "What's your take on this project of Torin's?" Nira was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface. "Kale is a brilliant man who's been broken by loss. What he's developing, it could change everything. Change how the Empire builds its power on technology, cities, fleets, communication networks, all dependent on synthetic materials and complex systems. What if something could break down that technology, reduce their mighty civilization to its organic components?" Jorok felt his blood chill. "You're talking about a bioweapon." "I'm talking about justice," Nira said, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "The Empire destroyed our world, Jorok. They're hunting down the survivors like animals. How many more colonies have to die before someone fights back? And you think I'm the man to help with that fight?" Nira leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I think you're a man who understands what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. I think you look at Kale and see yourself someone who loved something beautiful and watched it burn." She was right, and Jorok hated her for it. The woman he'd loved on Verdania, the squadron he'd commanded, the future he'd planned, all ash and memory now. But there was something else in Nira's eyes, something that made him lean closer. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked quietly. For just an instant, her mask slipped, and he saw fear and doubt flickering behind her confident facade. That maybe revenge isn't the answer, that maybe there's still time to choose a different path. But I'm not sure Kale will listen, and I'm not sure I have the strength to stop him if he won't." Jorok reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch was electric, unexpected, and completely inappropriate given the circumstances. But in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of their civilization, human connection felt more important than propriety. "Then maybe you need someone who does," he said. The transmission arrived during the night cycle, when Helix Station's corridors were dimmed and most refugees slept uneasily in their cramped quarters. Kale Torin sat alone in his laboratory, surrounded by holographic models of molecular structures that danced like deadly fireflies in the artificial darkness. 3 months of intensive work had brought his bioweapon to the brink of completion, a beautiful, terrible organism that could reduce the Zephyrian Empire's technological civilization to organic mulch within weeks. But the message that flickered to life on his personal communicator changed everything. The woman on the screen was haggard, her once golden hair now streaked with gray, her face bearing the marks of prolonged suffering. But her eyes, those warm brown eyes that had once gazed at him with love and trust, were unmistakably familiar. "Kale," Anya Coral whispered, her voice barely audible over the static. "If you're receiving this, then the rumors are true. You survived." Tears tracked down her cheeks as she spoke. "I'm on Zephyr Prime, in the labor camps beneath the capital. They told me you were dead, that everyone was dead. But I never stopped hoping." The transmission fractured, digital artifacts crawling across the image like insects. When it stabilized, Enya's expression had grown desperate. "I don't have much time. The guards will be back soon. Kale, I need you to know whatever you're planning, whatever they say you're building. I know you. I know your heart. Please, remember who we used to be before the war, before the hatred. Remember the garden we planted behind your parents' house. How we dreamed of growing something beautiful together." The signal died, leaving Kale staring at a blank screen. While his world crumbled around him, Anya was alive. The woman whose death had driven him to create an instrument of genocide was alive, imprisoned on the very world he intended to destroy. "Kale," Nira's voice came from the doorway, soft with concern. She entered the laboratory wearing a simple robe, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Over the past months, their partnership had deepened into something neither quite dared to name, a connection born of shared purpose and mutual understanding. "I heard you cry out. Are you?" She stopped when she saw his face, the devastation written in every line. "What's happened?" Wordlessly, Cale replayed the transmission. He watched Nira's expression shift from confusion to horror as she realized the implications. When the message ended, silence stretched between them like a chasm. "She's alive," Nira said finally, her voice hollow. "She's alive," Cale confirmed, his hands shaking as he reached for the weapon's activation controls. "And he couldn't finish the sentence. How close had he come to murdering the woman he loved in the name of avenging her death? Nira moved closer, her hand covering his before he could touch the controls. "We have to help her." "We?" Cale looked up at her, seeing something new in her green eyes, a pain that matched his own. "Nira, if I go to Zephyr Prime, I'll never return. It's a suicide mission." "Then we'll make it a successful suicide mission," she replied with forced lightness. "Break her out, get her to safety, and then decide what to do about the weapon." "Why would you risk that? You barely know her." Nira was quiet for a long moment, her hands still resting on his. "Because I've seen what losing someone you love can do to a person. And because," she met his eyes, vulnerability replacing her usual composure, "because I love you too much to watch you destroy yourself with guilt." The confession hung between them like a fragile bridge across an impossible divide. Cale felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously, torn between the woman he'd lost and the woman who was offering to help him find her again. "The infiltration won't be easy," he said, already beginning to plan despite the insanity of it. "Zephyr Prime is the most heavily defended world in the Empire. Getting in will require resources, contacts, and luck we don't have." "Actually," a familiar voice interrupted from the doorway, "you might have more resources than you think." Jorok Voss stepped into the laboratory, his expression grim but determined. Over the past weeks, the smuggler had become an unexpected ally, using his underworld connections to acquire the materials Cale needed for his research. But this request would push those connections to their breaking point. "I heard the transmission, too," Jorok explained. "Station communications aren't as secure as people think. And before you ask, yes, I know someone who can get us to Zephyr Prime undetected." "Us?" Nira asked, raising an eyebrow. Jorok's gaze flicked between her and Cale, something unreadable in his expression. "Like I'm going to let you to handle a prison break alone. Besides," he added with a sardonic smile, "I've always wanted to see the Empire's capital world, preferably while helping to undermine their slave labor program." Cale looked at his unlikely allies, the woman whose love had surprised him in the darkest moment of his life, and the cynical smuggler who had somehow rediscovered his capacity for heroism. 3 months ago, he had been alone with his grief and rage. Now he had partners willing to follow him into the heart of enemy territory to save a woman they'd never met. "Anya doesn't know about the weapon," he said quietly. "Or about us," he added, glancing at Nira. "She's going to expect the man she fell in love with on Verdania, not this." "Then maybe this mission is your chance to find him again," Nira replied. "The man who plants gardens instead of engineering apocalypses. And if we can't save her, then we'll honor her memory properly," Jorok said, his voice hard. "Not by becoming monsters, but by building something better from the ashes of what we've lost." Cale nodded slowly, then reached for his weapons control panel, not to activate it, but to engage the security locks that would prevent accidental deployment. Whatever happened on Zephyr Prime, he wouldn't compound tragedy with genocide. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The Wandering Star can be ready in 6 hours," Jorok replied. "The window for infiltrating Zephyr Prime opens in 3 days. Then we'd better get moving," Nira said, already planning their impossible rescue mission. As they worked through the night, preparing for a journey that might cost them everything, none of them noticed the encrypted transmission being sent from a hidden relay in Nira's quarters, a message bound for Imperial Command that would ensure their arrival on Zephyr Prime would not go undetected. The seeds of deception were finally bearing their bitter fruit. The labor camps of Zephyr Prime stretched across the planet's southern continent, like infected wounds in the metallic landscape from orbit. Jorah could see the geometric precision of the Empire's capital, gleaming spires and perfect, geometric districts that spoke of absolute control over nature. But here, beneath the glittering facade, millions of prisoners from conquered worlds toiled in the mineral extraction facilities that fed the Imperial war machine. There, Kale pointed to a cluster of facilities surrounded by energy barriers. Complex 7, according to the intelligence Jorah acquired. That's where they're holding the Verdanian survivors. The wandering star hung in the shadow of an asteroid processing station, its stealth systems masking their presence from Imperial sensors. Below them, Zephyr Prime rotated slowly, its artificial aurora displays painting the atmosphere in shades of purple and gold, beautiful and cold, like everything the Empire created. Guard rotation happens every 4 hours, Nira said, studying the tactical displays. We'll have a 20-minute window during the shift change. After that, she didn't need to finish. After that, they'd be trapped on the most heavily defended world in the galaxy with nowhere to run. Kale nodded, checking his equipment one final time. The infiltration gear felt strange after months of working with delicate biological samples. But as he secured his plasma cutter and emergency beacon, he found himself thinking not of revenge, but of redemption. Whatever he had become in his grief, Anya remembered the man he used to be. Perhaps that man could still be saved. Final systems check. Jorah announced from the pilot station. Once we're committed to this, there's no going back. There was never any going back. Kale replied quietly. Not after what the Empire did to our worlds. The infiltration went flawlessly at first. Jorah's underworld contacts had provided them with legitimate work permits and identity chips that passed every security scan. They landed at a maintenance depot on the camp's perimeter, posing as technicians sent to repair atmospheric processors. The irony wasn't lost on Kale. The same systems that kept the prisoners alive could have been the delivery mechanism for his bioweapon. Complex 7 was a nightmare of industrial efficiency. Thousands of prisoners moved through the facility, like components in a vast machine, breaking down raw ore under the watchful eyes of automated sentries. The air stank of ozone and despair, punctuated by the rhythmic hammering of mining equipment. Kale found Anya in processing bay 12, her golden hair now gray with rock dust, her hands scarred from months of brutal labor. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened in disbelief and desperate hope. "Kale," she whispered, hardly daring to believe. "You're real." He wanted to run to her, to hold her and promise that everything would be all right. But 20 other prisoners watched their reunion, and guards were never far away. Instead, he moved to her workstation with the casual confidence of a maintenance tech checking equipment. "We're getting you out of here," he said quietly, his hands working on her restraint collar. "All of you. But we need to move quickly." "How did you find me?" Anya asked, tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. "Love finds a way," he replied, and for the first time in months, the words felt true rather than bitter. The extraction went wrong when they reached the transport bay. Alarms began wailing throughout the complex, and blast doors started slamming shut across the facility. Through the chaos, Kale heard a voice he recognized with growing horror. "Attention, prisoners and rescue team," General Chorus announced over the facility's communication system. "This touching reunion has been most illuminating. Agent Salas, your services are no longer required." Kale spun to stare at Nira, understanding and betrayal warring in his expression. "Agent Salas," Nira's face was pale, her hands shaking as Imperial soldiers surrounded them. "Kale, I can explain. Your Zephyrian intelligence," he said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Everything the meeting in my lab, the weapon research, this rescue, it was all manipulation." "Not everything," she whispered, reaching toward him. "What I feel for you, that's real. I never intended." "Intended what?" Anya stepped forward, her voice sharp with hurt and confusion. "Kale, who is this woman?" Before anyone could answer, Jorah's voice crackled through their communication devices. "Imperial fleet incoming. Whatever you're planning down there, You've got about 5 minutes before this whole operation goes nova. General Chorus materialized as a hologram in the center of the transport bay. His scarred face twisted with satisfaction. Kale Torin, architect of genocide. Did you really think we'd let you develop your bioweapon without supervision? Agent Solace has been guiding your research from the beginning, ensuring it would be deployed against our enemies rather than our worlds. The Altarians, Nira said quietly, her voice filled with self-loathing. They're going to frame you for an attack on Altarian colonies. Make it look like Verdanian terrorism, while actually weakening the Federation. Kale felt the weight of his choices crushing down on him. His weapon, his carefully crafted instrument of revenge, would be used to commit genocide against another innocent people. The Empire would eliminate both the Verdanian survivors and their political rivals in one stroke, unless, Chorus continued, you'd prefer to watch your precious Anya die slowly in the processing chambers. The choice is yours, Torin. Activate your weapon against the Altarian colonies, or watch everyone you've ever loved suffer. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Anya's laughter. Not hysterical, but genuinely amused, as if she'd heard a particularly clever joke. Oh, Kale, she said, moving to stand beside him. Do you remember what you taught me about seeds? How the most beautiful gardens grow from the worst soil? He stared at her, not understanding, but Anya smiled the same radiant expression that had captured his heart years ago, and pulled a small device from her prison uniform. The bioweapon sample you brought with you, she said calmly. I've been working with the other scientists here. We made some modifications, Anya. What did you do? We planted a garden, she replied, activating the device, not for revenge, but for growth. Your organisms don't just break down synthetic materials. We taught them to create something new, something that breaks down the barriers between organic and artificial, between conqueror and conquered. Throughout Zephyr Prime, in every atmospheric processor and environmental system, microscopic organisms began their work. Not destruction, but transformation. Not genocide, but genesis. The Empire's perfect world was about to become something wild and uncontrollable, something alive. And in the chaos that followed, 3 unlikely lovers would find their own path to redemption among the growing vines.